Summer, 1940. The skies above southern England roared with the thunder of war. Black smoke curled across the white cliffs, and the future of Britain hung by a thread. The Luftwaffe's bombers filled the horizon like dark clouds of steel, and below them, what remained of the Royal Air Force scrambled for survival. Among those pilots was a man few would ever remember, Flight Lieutenant Eddy Hawthorne. He wasn't famous, not even within his squadron. But after one mission went horribly wrong, and his Spitfire spiraled into the fields of Kent in a plume of fire and twisted metal, his story should have ended there. It didn't. That crash would become the beginning of a story no one expected. The story of the forgotten pilot who, broken and grounded, built the plane that would save Britain. The summer air was thick with the oily scent of burning fuel and gunpowder. Eddy Hawthorne's hands gripped the control column as tracer rounds screamed past his canopy. He was young, just 24, but in the cockpit of his Spitfire, time didn't move normally. Every second felt stretched, every heartbeat echoing through the metallic cage around him. The Battle of Britain was not a battle of numbers. It was a battle of endurance, of men who flew until their bodies trembled from exhaustion and their eyes stung from smoke. That day, over the channel, Eddy's squadron was ambushed. Outnumbered 3-1, they faced the wrath of the Luftwaffe's finest. The sky became chaos, shrapnel, sunlight, and terror all blending into one. A shell ripped through his right wing. The aircraft lurched violently, the sound of tearing aluminum screaming through his headset. He pulled the stick, but control was slipping. Flames licked along the fuselage as black smoke poured into the cockpit. The temperature spiked. His gloves burned against the metal throttle. He had seconds, maybe less. "Mayday! Mayday! Hawthorne going down!" His voice broke through static as the channel blurred below him. Then, impact. The world went white. When he opened his eyes, the fire had gone, replaced by the heavy scent of wet earth and smoke. He was alive, barely. The wreck of his Spitfire lay scattered across a Kentish field, pieces of its frame jutting out like broken bones. Locals rushed to him, pulling his limp body from the wreckage. For the first time, the man who had danced through clouds was grounded, permanently. The doctors said he would never fly again. His back was shattered, his lungs scarred by smoke and heat. But as Britain braced for invasion, Eddy could think of only one thing: his plane. In the hospital ward, he listened to the distant drone of bombers at night. The men beside him were pilots too, some broken, some blinded, all restless. "You're lucky to be alive," the nurse told him. But for Eddy, it didn't feel like luck. It felt like failure. He could not stand. He could barely breathe. Yet in his silence, his mind worked. He remembered every vibration of that crash, the way the wing tore apart, how the engine failed under stress, how smoke filled the cockpit too fast to escape. Those moments replayed endlessly. He began sketching, at first just on scraps of paper, fragments of wings and designs he thought could save lives. He wasn't an engineer, at least not by training, but war changes a man's identity. Every pilot knew the machine like his own heartbeat. Eddy started studying the Spitfire's blueprints, borrowed from a mechanic who pitied him. He traced the airflow lines, marked the weak spots, redesigned the ventilation system that had nearly suffocated him. His ideas were unorthodox, inspired not by textbooks, but by pain, by what it felt like to be trapped in a burning sky. Outside the hospital walls, Britain was burning too. The Luftwaffe's bombing runs intensified. London glowed red at night. The RAF was losing planes faster than they could be built. Factories worked day and night, yet pilots flew patched-up machines riddled with flaws. And somewhere in that chaos, a letter was sent, a quiet note from a grounded pilot to an engineer he'd never met, attached to a hand-drawn sketch. The letter read, "So, if we can't make them faster, we must make them survive longer." Weeks later, a reply came. It bore the signature of a name Eddy recognized from whispers in the hangars. R.J. Mitchell's successor, Joseph Smith, the chief designer at Supermarine. "We received your sketch," the note said. "You may be onto something." For the first time since his crash, Eddy felt the weight lift. His war was no longer in the sky. It was on the drawing board. The same hands that once gripped a control stick now held a pencil. And in that pencil drawn over the memory of fire and failure lay the outline of Britain's future wings. The war didn't slow for anyone, not even for the broken. Eddy Hawthorne learned that from the sterile silence of a rehabilitation ward, where men who once ruled the skies now fought for inches of movement. But he refused to surrender to stillness. He had traded altitude for purpose. His ideas, once dismissed as idle thoughts of a crippled pilot, began to take form. Using a cane and sheer will, he made his way to the Supermarine facility in Southampton, the heart of British aviation. The building smelled of oil, steel, and exhaustion. Every rivet hammered into an aircraft frame was a heartbeat in Britain's defense. The engineers eyed him with polite indifference at first. A pilot walking into a room full of draftsmen was like a soldier stepping into a surgeon's theater, out of place. "You flew one," they said. "You didn't build one." But Eddie's sketches spoke louder than his uniform. They were rough, born from memory and pain, but they revealed something crucial: an understanding of how the Spitfire behaved under stress, not just in theory, but in the chaos of war. He spoke with passion that silenced the room. When the cockpit fills with smoke, you can't see the gauges. You don't think, you panic. If there was a better airflow duct, if the heat shield wrapped differently, he paused, his hands trembling slightly. We wouldn't lose so many good men to fire. Not bullets. Joseph Smith, the quiet, methodical designer who had inherited Mitchell's legacy, studied him carefully. Smith was not easily moved by sentiment, but he saw something in Hawthorne, something raw and real. He handed him a stool and said simply, "Show me." That moment marked the birth of an unlikely partnership, one forged not from titles or rank, but from shared purpose. Day after day, Hawthorne became a fixture in the hangar. While his body healed in fragments, his mind soared higher than ever. He worked beside engineers, running his fingers along the fuselage panels, describing how vibrations changed under dive stress, how the controls stiffened when the wings flexed. The others began to listen. He didn't speak like a scientist. He spoke like a survivor of the machine. His observations led to refinements that would save lives. Redesigned ventilation ducts to clear smoke faster, reinforced cockpit frames to protect pilots during crash landings, a new release mechanism for the canopy that could be opened even under pressure. Still, not everyone believed in him. Some called him the grounded dreamer. Others said he was chasing ghosts, wasting resources when the factory needed speed, not perfection. The war demanded production, not innovation. Yet Eddy refused to be dismissed. "Speed means nothing if it burns," he said. "We need planes that can take a hit and still bring a man home." At night, he would sit alone under the dim light of his workbench, staring at the blueprints, tracing each line as if it were the veins of a living thing. He thought about the men still flying, his friends, his brothers in the air, and how each small improvement might mean the difference between life and death. The Spitfire was already a marvel, a dancer in the clouds, but Eddy wanted it to be a survivor too. One evening, as bombs thundered over Southampton, the engineers refused to stop working. The ground shook, windows rattled, dust fell from the ceiling, yet they stayed, illuminated by the glow of burning skies outside. Hawthorne limped to the shelter door and looked out across the harbor. Flames reflected on the waves, and above them, a lone Spitfire clawed through the night sky toward the enemy formation. He whispered under his breath, "She's fighting because we still are." That night, after the all clear, something remarkable happened. Smith approached Hawthorne with a small metal prototype in his hand, a modified air intake vent designed according to Hawthorne's sketches. "We're testing this tomorrow," Smith said. "If it works, you've changed how these birds breathe." Eddy couldn't sleep. He sat awake listening to the distant hum of aircraft engines, the sound that had once been his life. For a man who could no longer fly, this was the closest thing to resurrection. When dawn came, the test pilot took off with the new design. The hangar crew watched as the Spitfire climbed gracefully into the morning light. Minutes later, it dodged, rolled, and pulled sharp turns, and when it landed, the pilot stepped out, grinning. "Airflow's clean," he said. "No smoke, no pressure buildup. She handles like a dream." For a moment, the room erupted in quiet celebration. claps on shoulders, smiles through exhaustion. Hawthorne just stood there watching through tear-glazed eyes as the plane taxied back toward the hangar. In that moment, he realized something profound. He didn't need to fly to defend his country anymore. His legacy would soar without him. Yet, deep inside, a question lingered. How many more lives could be saved if the rest of his designs were approved? If he could convince the higher command that these changes weren't luxuries, but necessities? His greatest battle was no longer fought in the skies above Britain. It was fought on paper, in meetings, and in the hearts of men who had forgotten what innovation costs. The forgotten pilot had found his purpose again, Moss. But the war would soon test just how far his ideas could truly fly. The test fields of southern England were quiet that morning, too quiet for war. Mist rolled low across the grass, swallowing the distant shapes of aircraft lined up like sentinels. The Spitfire stood among them, gleaming faintly under the pale dawn light. It was no longer the same plane that had first taken flight years ago. Its heart, its breath, had been changed by the hands of a man who could no longer fly. Eddy Hawthorne stood at the edge of the runway, leaning heavily on his cane. The scars on his face caught the light, but his eyes were alive again, bright, restless, searching. Around him, ground crews moved with purpose, tightening bolts, refueling tanks, checking pressure lines. Somewhere inside the hangar, Joseph Smith adjusted his hat and said, "If it fails, we lose nothing. But if it works, we win the sky." This test wasn't just mechanical, it was personal. For months, Eddy had fought to convince the Air Ministry that his changes mattered. Meetings filled with polished men in pressed uniforms dismissed his proposals as unnecessary refinements. Britain needed planes fast, they argued, not experiments. But Smith had quietly pushed the prototypes through. And now, this one flight would decide whether Hawthorne's vision lived or died. The pilot climbed into the cockpit, a young man barely out of training, his cheeks still soft, his hands trembling slightly on the control stick. Eddy watched as the canopy closed with a reassuring click. His canopy, the one he had redesigned so that no pilot would ever be trapped again. The engine roared to life, coughing smoke and fire into the fog. The air vibrated. Mechanics covered their ears. Then the Spitfire began to move. Its takeoff was smooth, almost graceful. The sound of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, deep, throaty, alive, filled the field. The aircraft lifted, wheels tucking in like a bird's claws. For a moment, the mist parted, and the machine climbed straight into the sky, its wings slicing through the white air. Down below, Eddy could barely breathe. Every second felt like an eternity. He knew what was being tested wasn't just metal and fuel, it was his redemption. At 10,000 feet, the pilot began the stress maneuvers. Tight rolls, dives, power climbs. The radio crackled with static. Then the voice came through. Air pressure holding, canopy intact, airflow steady. Smith smiled faintly, but Eddy didn't move. He waited for the words he feared most, the ones he'd heard too many times during his service. But instead, what came was joy. "She flies smoother than any spit I've touched," the pilot shouted over the radio. "Feels lighter, steadier. She doesn't fight me. She dances." Eddy's hand clenched around his cane. For the first time since his crash, he felt the wind again. Not on his skin, but in his soul. His design worked. His broken wings had found a new way to fly. The modified Spitfire, now incorporating Hawthorne's airflow and cockpit changes, began to spread across production lines quietly. Pilots noticed immediately. The Hawthorne variant, they called it unofficially. It wasn't a new plane by name, but in spirit, it was reborn. When the Battle of Britain reached its fiercest weeks, those refinements would save hundreds of men. Pilots who once burned alive in enclosed cockpits were now able to eject and survive. Aircraft once prone to engine suffocation and hard dives now kept fighting longer. The difference was invisible to the eye, a few ducts, a reshaped frame. But in the chaos of war, small things often decided life or death. The news reached Eddy not through medals or letters, but through whispers. Mechanics talked about it in canteens. Pilots mentioned it in passing. "Thank God for whoever fixed those smoke vents," one said. "Saved me over Dover." Eddy smiled quietly, never revealing it was his doing. One night, a telegram arrived at his door. Short, unassuming, it read, "Your design kept us alive today. Thank you. Squadron 92. He held it in his trembling hands for a long time, his eyes wet with pride and pain. The crash that had broken him had led to this moment, a transformation not of the machine, but of the man who built it. But with victory came a shadow. The Luftwaffe wasn't giving up, and Britain's skies grew darker every week. Eddy's designs had given the RAF a fighting chance, but now a new threat loomed. Faster German fighters, heavily armed and built for domination. If Britain was to survive, the Spitfire would need more than small improvements. It needed evolution. And deep down, Eddy knew that evolution would come at a cost. In the quiet hours of the night, he stared at new sketches scattered across his table. Curved wings, retractable systems, experimental engines. It was madness to even attempt during wartime production. But so was everything that had ever changed history. He whispered to himself, "They can take my wings, but they'll never ground my ideas." The forgotten pilot had built a machine that saved Britain once, but now he would have to push it beyond anything anyone believed possible. By mid-1940, the war over Britain had turned into a storm of steel and smoke. The Luftwaffe had come in waves. Heinkels, Dorniers, Messerschmitts, dark crosses blotting out the sun over southern England. The Battle of Britain was not fought on the ground. It was waged in the thin, freezing air miles above the Channel, where courage and invention met head-on. For months, Eddy Hawthorne had lived between two worlds, the workshop and the warfront. Every morning, he rose before dawn, his limp heavier with each step, his cane tapping the cold floors of the design hangar. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't even supposed to be part of the Royal Air Force. Yet every rivet, every bolt, every curve of the new Spitfire carried his fingerprints. The RAF was bleeding men and machines. Pilots returned shaken, their aircraft shredded with bullet holes and burns. Some never returned at all. The Luftwaffe's Bf-19s were faster at altitude, deadlier in dives. For every British fighter shot down, replacements had to be built faster, smarter, stronger. The ministry wanted numbers. Eddy wanted survival. In one corner of the hangar, a new model sat beneath the canvas. His next gamble? A re-engineered Spitfire frame designed to climb faster, turn tighter, and breathe longer in high-altitude fights. The secret lay in his airflow experiments. Modified intake systems that fed the Merlin engine even when the plane should have been gasping. To the untrained eye, it looked identical, but in combat, the difference would mean everything. He called it, quietly, the Phoenix. But convincing the higher-ups was another war entirely. Commanders were skeptical, production chiefs furious. "You're asking us to change the blueprint in the middle of a war," one officer barked. "Do you want chaos in the factories?" Eddy, steady but burning inside, replied, "No, sir. I want fewer funerals." The room went silent. Finally, permission came, not as support, but as a test, one prototype, one chance. If it failed, it would die with him. The day of the test arrived under a sky bruised with storm clouds. Hawthorne stood beside the runway again, his breath fogging in the wind. The pilot, the same young man who had flown his last design, gave him a firm nod before climbing in. The engine ignited, echoing like thunder across the airfield. As the propeller blurred into invisibility, the Phoenix surged forward and tore into the sky. Moments later, German bombers were reported crossing the Channel. It was no longer a test. It was war. The prototype, still unpainted and raw, joined a flight of 4 Spitfires heading south. What followed would later be known as one of the fiercest dogfights of the battle, a clash above the white cliffs of Dover that turned the tide in a single afternoon. At 20,000 feet, they met the enemy. The air was alive with tracer fire. Thin streaks of light burning through the clouds. The Phoenix dove headlong into chaos. The pilot throttled hard, and for the first time, the new intake system kicked in. The engine roared, stable, unbroken. He rolled beneath a Messerschmitt, fired, and watched it fall, smoke trailing like a dying comet. Down below in the control tower, Eddy listened to the radio feed. Static, shouting, heavy breathing. "She's holding steady at altitude, yee. Climb rate unbelievable. I'm on their tails. Each word tightened his chest. He could almost feel the wind, smell the oil, taste the fear. One of the Spitfires was hit, flames engulfing its wing, but its pilot managed to eject, the canopy release functioning flawlessly. Another of Eddy's designs saving a life. Then came the final moment. The prototype, pursued by two enemy fighters, broke formation. It dove toward the sea, the German planes right behind it. Ground control screamed for the pilot to pull up. Instead, he waited until the altimeter spun into the red. Then, with a sudden surge, the Phoenix climbed, vertical, impossible, roaring past the Germans as their engines choked, installed in the thin air. One went down, the other turned tail. When the Phoenix landed, its wings were riddled with holes, its fuselage scorched. But it had survived, and so had its pilot. The hangar erupted in cheers. For the first time in months, the ground crew smiled. Smith clapped Eddy on the shoulder and said quietly, "You've given them more than a machine. You've given them hope." News of the modified Spitfire spread fast. Within weeks, factories were instructed to incorporate Hawthorne's changes into new production models. Engineers across Britain worked by candlelight, cutting metal and sealing rivets through endless night. And when the next wave of Luftwaffe attacks came, the RAF met them with an edge they had never had before. It wasn't just the plane that changed the Battle of Britain. It was the spirit behind it, the invisible hands of a man who had once fallen from the skeet who now helped others stay aloft. But even as the tide turned, Eddy Hawthorne remained quiet, watching from the shadows of his workshop. He knew victory was fragile, and behind every triumph there was always sacrifice. The war wasn't over, the sky still burned, and deep inside him, one truth echoed louder than the sound of any engine. The machines may have carried the fight, but it was the courage of broken men that made them feet-bomb. When the smoke finally began to clear over the British coast, the skies no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The air above Dover, Kent, in London now roared with the steady hum of Spitfires, the symbol of defiance, of endurance, of survival. Yet behind every gleaming aircraft, there was a man who never flew again. Eddy Hawthorne watched them take off, one after another, his cane pressed into the damp earth, the wind catching his coat like a flag at half-mast. The war was far from over, but something had shifted. The Battle of Britain had become the turning point, not just strategically, but spiritually. It proved that machines, when guided by the hands of visionaries, could protect rather than destroy. Hawthorne's re-engineered design was now standard issue, quietly marked in factory records as Model H modification. The name Phoenix never appeared in any report. The world would never know it was his idea, his redemption, that helped win the sky. He never asked for credit. The medal they offered, he refused. When the officer tried to hand it to him, Eddy simply said, "Give it to the ones who didn't come back." Then he turned and limped out into the fog, disappearing into the crowd of men who built, repaired, and risked everything without recognition. But history has a strange way of remembering what bureaucracy forgets. Years later, long after the war had ended and cities had begun to heal, a young engineer found an old sketchbook buried in the archives of Supermarine, its pages yellowed, corners burned from the fire of 1940. Inside were rough pencil drawings, formulas scrawled in the margins, and a single name signed in fading ink, EH, Prototype Airflow System, Spitfire Mach-2. He had written in the corner, almost as a whisper to himself, "You can't rebuild a man, but you can rebuild what he believes in." That one sentence told the story better than any medal or memorial ever could. Because what Hawthorne rebuilt wasn't just a plane, it was faith. Faith that one mistake doesn't define a life, that a broken wing can still teach others how to fly. The RAF continued to dominate the skies, but to Eddy, victory was never measured in numbers. It was measured in faces of the young pilots who returned alive, the families who didn't receive telegrams of loss, the quiet nights when bombers didn't come. He saw in every contrail above London not a weapon, but a promise that courage could outlast chaos. By the time he passed away in the late 1950s, few remembered his name. His war records listed him as flight lieutenant, discharged due to injury. His work was scattered through design patents, memos, and production notes. Yet every time a Spitfire soared across the post-war skies in remembrance ceremonies, its elegant climb carried a piece of him, the whisper of an engineer who once crashed, fell, and rose again through the machines he built. If you listen closely to those engines, even now, decades later, you can almost hear what he stood for. The roar is not just metal and fire. It's the sound of defiance, of redemption, of a man who found purpose in failure. Eddy Hawthorne's story reminds us of something eternal, that history isn't written by the flawless, but by the determined. That greatness often begins in silence, in the shadow of loss, in the trembling hands of those who refuse to give up. He was not a legend carved in stone, nor a name etched on metals. He was something rarer, a man who rebuilt the very wings that once broke him. And that, in the quiet truth of history, is how Britain was saved by a forgotten pilot who refused to stay grounded.